today as far as threats towards organizations, especially when you look at how things have changed from, traditional companies being on premise, having employees in their workforce working in different locations. We've all kind of moved to the remote workforce strategy very quickly. And that's brought a lot of different challenges for a lot of different companies. Everything from latency issues. There's a company that I was talking to that's more in the gaming industry where they converted over, and there's a lot of problems that you experience as you're kind of going through remote workforce transitions. And what's interesting now is if you look at all of the things that's going on with COVID-19. When you look at how hackers typically break into a lot of different organizations, it's usually through creating fear. That's usually one of the main methods that most attackers will use when they're using something like phishing campaigns or social engineering. They'll use fear as a method to gain access. And what better to use a pandemic to leverage enticing victims to going to different sites and having different issues that way. We'll talk a little bit about that and show you what we've been seeing out there and talk about what companies can do to really kind of address some of those situations. Just a brief introduction myself. My name is Dave Kennedy. I've been in the security industry now for about 20 years. I've done everything from testifying in front of Congress on a number of occasions to being on TV quite often. I'm on CNN and Fox and CNBC and MSNBC. I helped out with the TV show Mr. Robot, which was a TV show with Christian Slater and Rami Malek on USA. It was pretty cool. The Social Engineer Toolkit. I wrote one of the best-selling books in hacking called Metasploit: The Penetration Tester's Guide. And I keynote pretty much all across the world when it comes to being an authoritative source on information security and cybersecurity. I'm also the co-founder of Binary Defense and another security firm, TrustedSec. So I started Binary Defense a number of years ago with really trying to help companies, protect companies, get better with what they're doing, dealing with information security. So just a little bit of background myself on that. Familiar with us, why this talk is important today is we're really the eyes and ears of everything that's happening out there right now when it comes to cybersecurity. There's a lot of attacks happening. There's a lot of fear happening right now. There's a lot of there was just a hospital the other day that was hit with ransomware, where they shut down the entire hospital, and obviously a very critical time right now for that to happen. What's interesting is there's a big ransomware campaign out there right now called Ryuk. There's a really big organized crime group that's out there, and they had said that they were going to stop targeting hospitals for the foreseeable future and allow them to operate during this crisis situation. Very, very nice of the organized crime groups to do. And they have since turned, they lasted about a week and then started targeting hospitals again. So not very, very loyal to their word of what they're going after, and they've been actually targeting hospitals pretty heavily as of late. But that's really what we do at Binary Defense is we monitor and track what the hackers are doing, and we prevent breaches from happening for these organizations. So we have a 24/7 security operations center, which is purely remote right now because we're not allowed to be on premise. And so we have a 24/7, 365 days a year security operations center, and we have tooling that can be deployed very easily to customers to monitor what they're doing, to monitor what attackers are doing, and then prevent large-scale breaches. We'll talk a little bit about some of the breaches that we're seeing right now and really kind of the damages that we're seeing to some customers. And really what we do is we minimize that damage. We stop that damage from happening. We isolate and contain systems. We know when hackers are breaking into specific organizations. And then we have an intelligence, what we call a threat intelligence and counterintelligence team that looks for these hackers 24/7, 365. So we're always looking for hackers trying to do things across organizations and really try to protect our customers. So here's a little bit about the agenda today. Wanted to talk a little about current state of what we're seeing, a little bit about the remote workforce, some of the phishing we're seeing. I actually have some live examples of what we're seeing in the wild right now. So you'll see some very specific things. They're using text messages. They're using COVID-19, as a mask for a lot of that. The rebate incentives that you're getting with the new bill that was passed, the CARE Act. They're doing a lot of different campaigns right now against it. We've seen hundreds of percentages of increases of COVID-19 fake domains that are being used right now. Thousands and thousands of them being used right now for launching attacks. And then we'll talk about the top 5 things that you can talk to your customers about that they should be doing, especially when you're talking about a remote workforce. Things that they can do to better their infrastructure, things that they should be looking at very quickly to implement as they've moved more towards a remote workforce strategy for the foreseeable future. And again, happy to answer any questions. But you look at what we're talking about today. What's interesting is before this all hit, customers really struggled with the amount of time hackers had in their organizations, and that's really the biggest challenge right now. Is you look at all of these big data breaches that are out there, and attackers could break in and have access to your environment for 3 days, 6 months, 2 years, 10 years, and you would have no idea in most cases. You look at the Marriott Starwood data breach, for example. Hackers were on there for several years before Marriott actually identified it. And the only reason they identified that it was Chinese hackers in this specific case, they had broken into the database that monitored all of the booking reservations for Starwood hotels. So they could track, who was staying there, credit card data, the individual people. So they were able to use it as a tracking mechanism for individuals that they might want to actually do surveillance on. And the only reason they actually found that hackers had broken into that specific database was they were running a simulated hack, and the hackers that were the good hackers were like, hey, we should break into this database because it has all of the information around people that are staying at these specific hotels. Let's break into that. And they broke in and found that there was already hackers in there, and they had been there for several years. So it's a problem for a lot of companies because they don't know when they've been hacked that they've had a large amount of data breaches. I'm going to talk about ransomware too, because I'm sure most of your customers are extremely concerned about ransomware. And what's changed with ransomware over the past 2 years than it was 4 years ago is that ransomware first started off in its infancy phases of going after your grandma, going after all of these different folks and encrypting their drives, and that was kind of pennies on the dollar. And what happened then is if you go back a number of years, there was what was called the Carter market, the credit card market. And I'm sure everybody remembers Home Depot, Jimmy John's, Target, all these different breaches that happened, and we all had to get our credit cards reissued, and there was these just bulk heists of credit cards that were getting compromised. And what happened is that the retail stores, they invested very heavily in what we call point of sale encryption. So when you actually swipe your card, that hardware device that you're swiping on actually does the encryption itself and then sends it back. And so hackers lost a whole area of revenue stream that they originally had. And so a lot of those really good hackers that were good at developing all this code to steal all those credit cards moved into ransomware. And what it really is now is it's really ransomware as a service. There's a whole market around building out infrastructure and then handing it out to less sophisticated hackers. They go through, they send all the campaigns, and they get a certain percentage of it. So it's a big market right now. And I'll talk about how much financials, but we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of profit from ransomware. And what's changed from like 4 years ago to now is that they're no longer just hacking into a company and then encrypting what they have access, what that individual computer has access to. They're actually manually hacking into organizations to get as much damage as possible, inflict as much damage as possible to an organization, including their online and offline backups, going after as many systems as possible, data centers, and encrypting everything all at once, spending several days, if not weeks, in an organization, and then they basically shut the entire company down. And then the only way that you really can recover is either A, paying the ransom, or hoping that you have a really good offline data backup strategy for those. And they're really good at hunting for backups. They're really good at hunting for how you restore your systems. They spend a lot of time learning your organization. It's really changed, and they're really much more sophisticated than they ever were before. And these are full-fledged businesses. I mean, they have better customer support than Time Warner Cable in most cases. You can get responses back to them very quickly. They'll respond back to you. And it is a business model. They usually will restore your files because they don't want to have a bad name for not restoring your files when you actually pay the ransom. So a lot of companies are paying the ransom because of how they've done it. And it's no longer the days of again, years ago where we might be able to find a flaw in the actual code to allow us to recover the data. In most cases, if you get hit with ransomware, it's near impossible to actually recover the keys, to restore them, and not have to pay the ransom in the first place. So it's very costly for organizations. We had a company that paid $4 million for ransom recently. So it's a very damaging thing for an organization. Shuts them down completely. And obviously, with times right now, with everybody being remote, if your infrastructure is down, your entire company is completely shut down. So there's a lot of things happening right now as we speak. And COVID-19 is a big area of push for deploying ransomware in the initial early stages. If you look at some of the demographics of hackers, organized crime is by far the largest prominence of what we see for most attackers out there. Organized crime, I mean, you're talking full-fledged businesses. They have folks spread all across the world. There was just recently where the FBI named a number of folks in Russia, which we're never going to get them in Russia, who are part of a very large organized crime group. The person that runs this organized crime group, is driving Mercedes and Benzes, it had a $10 million wedding. They're making tons of money off of these ransomware campaigns, and it's really an organized crime group that has marketing, it has sales. It has programmers, it has people that are weaponizing tools and attacking. I mean, you're talking 60, 70 people companies that are using this as a deployment method to gain money against organizations. So, companies really struggle with these specific ones because the sophistication levels a lot of these attackers continue to increase. You also have nation states where you see recently WHO was hacked, the World Health Organization was hacked, and it's loosely attributed to China. They say a very sophisticated attacker. Most of the evidence points towards China as hacking the World Health Organization. And so you see these nation states compromising industries, whether it's defense, medical research, intellectual property theft, when it comes to military preparedness, all of those things are capabilities of what we see from a nation state perspective. You also have individual hacking, individuals going after and targeting organizations, individual people. All of those things continue to occur. And then hacktivism, which we see less of, the days of Anonymous and LulzSec and all these different groups that used to come out to cause pandemonium and mayhem. But you see groups actively going after different organizations to hack them and try to take them down based off of specific beliefs, usually political beliefs in many cases. And so talking about the COVID-19 response, when you look at most organizations, they've had to adapt and work from home, which it was easy for some companies. It was very difficult for others. And that challenge was, we have to spin up all of our people that we're used to having on site and move them to an infrastructure that allows them to work from home. And a lot of companies had to open up, systems, had to open up resources, stand up VPN concentrators if they didn't have it, Citrix environments, and get all that remote work at home set up pretty quickly. And most of the complaints that I hear from most folks that have worked from home is that they're basically given a link to click, and then all of a sudden now they're supposed to be working from home. There was no education awareness around what they're supposed to do or how they're supposed to work from home. So a lot of that really comes into, hey, I have no idea what I'm doing, but at least I can still get access to my systems. And most organizations, when they went remote from home, work from home, if you think about it, when you're sitting at home, you have thousands of devices, hundreds of devices on your network, everything from your smart thermostats to your kids, browsing, for school, to your wife's computers, your spouse's computers. All that stuff is on that network that you're now on, and it's now connecting to resources in your internal network at your businesses that now attackers could potentially have access to. So if I'm going to compromise, an individual, I can go through a lot of these other devices, gain access to your computer, and then from there into your corporate network. And so, if you look at since March 1st, we've seen a 3,987% increase in COVID-19 related phishing domains. It's crazy. Now, obviously, COVID-19 has been a very popular thing. It's consuming all of us right now. And so you'd expect to see an increase, but they're using that as a main method to target individuals and employees right now with COVID-19 related phishing campaigns. It's like the #1 hottest topic for attackers right now to go after. And you look at what they try to do, there's a few methods that they're using right now. First and foremost, what they'll get you to do is they'll get you to click a link, and in that link, it'll either try to redirect you to your online, like whether it's Microsoft Online with Office 365 or a portal, and they'll get you to enter in your username and password, and then they'll steal those passwords to try to authenticate into your network. What they'll also do is get you to download a specific file that you might need. We've seen a COVID-19 one where it's a Zoom phish, where they'll get you to try to download the updated Zoom client, which is backdoored, and then it compromises your computer and then gives you full access to your computer in the first place. So there's a lot of different phishing campaigns that we see kind of going on right now, all with the intent of getting access to your account, getting access to your network, and then from there, trying to move into the internal network to get as much access as possible for ransomware campaigns. So we're seeing a lot of those sophisticated attacks continue to happen as we go along. Excuse me. We've seen a huge increase in breach companies. One thing that we do is we also do what's called incident response. And with incident response, when a company gets hacked, we can go into an organization and respond to an incident to see what actually happened. Right now, our incident responders are literally at capacity. We're dealing with companies that are being breached left and right. that had no visibility into their endpoints, had no visibility into the remote workforce. And then from there, the attackers spread across their network, and then from there, basically crippled them to where they have to respond to those specific threats. And so we're going in trying to help them out, respond to them, and try to boot the hackers out as we're fighting them in different companies. So we're seeing a very large increase in incident response. And several companies, are already compromised and are being attacked, just have no idea that it's actually occurring right now because of the remote workforce strategy. Some of us are fighting against it. There was a group created by a few awesome security folks called the CTI League, and what we're doing is it's a group of about 500 plus hackers that are going against a lot of these groups that are attacking different companies and organizations. We're partnering with a lot of the different companies that host domains. So if we see phishing domains that are being registered, we're getting takedown notices sent to them and shutting them down. We have a whole group of people that are basically reverse engineering all of the code, looking at what's happening to get better indicators out there to identify what threats are happening. So there's a lot of people out there really trying to fight against this during this time, because it's a very critical time for us. Probably the biggest, the largest increase that we've seen in hacker activity in for the immediate history. So we're all trying to kind of fight against this, more of a league of researchers in different areas of expertise, trying to fight against it. So there are a lot of good positives happening. We have successfully shut down really big campaigns over the world as of recently. So it's had a lot of great success in trying to minimize a lot of the damage to businesses. You look at hospitals. Just the other day, this was March 26th, the riot, one of the largest ransomware campaigns. They're targeting specific hospitals. There was a hospital that actually shut down. At least portions of it were shut down. The World Health Organization was hacked. Again, we start to see a lot of these different attacks happening out there over a given time. Here's what the campaigns kind of look like. This is one that we saw where you click a link and it looks like the World Health Organization. And there is actually a flaw in one of the subdomains of HHS. So the Human Health Services .gov. So HHS.gov, there was a vulnerability in one of the sites where it looked like it was actually going to HHS, but it would actually redirect you to a malicious attacker site. And that was being used very heavily early on to compromise people and make it more believable, because a lot of times we'll tell people in education awareness, hey, you need to trust it, hover over the link, make sure the link that you're going to is actually a legitimate website. It was actually going to a legitimate HHS website, but it had a vulnerability in it that would allow it to redirect to a malicious website. And so hackers were using that for a while to get people to go to it, to compromise them and have direct access to their computers. So they're getting a little bit more complex in some of these different ones that we see out there. And this one is basically, a look to harvest information, to grab your phone number. And here what they would do is they'd send you a text message and have you enter in credentials and information there that was coming through the specific site. So again, a lot of weird, sites. This is a fake one that's happening currently out there today. Text messages. Here we saw one alert: the emergency response benefit of Canada's relief fund has sent you a deposit for $1375.50. This is obviously in Canada. Click here to this specific website, emergency Canada response.xyz. Data rates may apply. You click there, still your data, still your information, still your banking information, and they have access to all of that data that you have. So again, they're using text messages, they're using emails, whatever they can do to kind of go after individuals and folks in many cases. And so you can see kind of happening everywhere. WHO, the World Health Organization, as I mentioned before, was attacked by hackers. Luckily, at least what the World Health Organization said was they didn't have access to any critical systems or anything as far as super sensitive data. The CDC was also attacked. Hackers posing as CDC also using as phishing campaigns. The CDC came back and said that they had no access to anything critical in any case, so that's a good thing. Europol's chasing hackers down. It's kind of a mess out there right now for what we're seeing. There's just so much stuff and chaos kind of happening out there with a lot of these different campaigns that it's a lot to kind of chew on. And again, most organizations when they went to work from home have little to no strategy around when these actual systems are being compromised. They're literally completely blind to these attacks happening. They have no idea that they're happening, and it's usually too late when they actually have access to other systems. They've penetrated in further into the network, and that's usually when they have the massive problems. And that's one thing I want to hit on really quick is that when an attacker gains access to an individual computer, that computer is very rarely the destination of what they want access to. They usually want access to backups. They usually want access to your file servers that have a lot of your data on it, your intellectual property servers. And so they'll use that computer as a pivot point to move to other systems. It's what we call lateral movement. And so you see these attacks kind of happen and go into different other systems, like from one system to another workstation, or to a server that has access to data, and they spread across the network, kind of like an infection. Very similar to that across the network, as they kind of replicate across the network itself, and then from there they target and shut down the company, or they will steal that intellectual property. And again, a lot of companies really have little to no visibility into that. And so if you look at how ransomware has evolved, I've talked about this before, but it really started off as small, but it's morphed into a multi million-dollar industry. And really, when you talk to most companies, ransomware is probably the biggest risk for most companies of what they perceive as their biggest worry from an organization perspective. I mean, you can shut down attackers. The latest hospital hack within 4 hours. So within 4 hours of the initial machine being compromised, they'd already spread to 30 systems on the network and completely shut down the hospital. So you saw this kind of happen very quickly, very fast within an organization. They only had 4 hours to respond to a specific threat. So very quick at what they do, very fast at what they do, and they use it as a way to make it much more difficult to find them in early stages. And so if you look at the top group out there, one of the top hacker groups yielded over $76 million in profits for ransomware. $76 million is a lot of money. That's a big business to be running in ransomware campaigns. So that came directly from the FBI. And really, when you look at ransomware, it's to maximize the amount of damage you have towards a company so that they actually pay it back. And when you get hit with a ransomware, you're probably not going to be operational for at least 2 weeks. And so that's a very big make or break for a company. Some companies you might be able to get back operational in a week. Normally, on average, I'd say most companies it takes about 2 weeks to get operational, back into working piece again, and getting all of your stuff restored and being able to restore from the encryption keys itself. It's interesting. They're very fast, and they spend a lot of time on the encryption part of it and actually encrypting your files and systems. But they have really bad processes around decrypting. So the decryption process is not maximized, and the tools are usually pretty strung together. And it takes a lot of time to decrypt those systems and get everything back in operational. They don't spend a lot of time on getting your files back. They spend a lot of time on encrypting your files in the first place. You look at the FBI. In general, this is a statistic from the FBI. Over $140 million have been handed over to ransomware attackers just last year. And so, as mentioned before, Riot was the most profitable ransomware family over the past 6 years. So, it's one of those things where, again, a lot of money to be made, a lot of hackers doing a lot of bad things. So let's talk a little about what companies can do. Obviously, that was a lot of scaring up front to show you what's actually happening out there, giving you an understanding around what's actually occurring. But there's some things that companies really can do to really help maximize their and reduce their risk of what's happening out there today. Number one is what we call multi-factor authentication. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. When you go to log into, let's just say Office 365, or you go to log into a system, it might send you a text message on your phone saying, hey, you need to enter in a one-time PIN to log into your device in the first place. And that's one of those things where, from a multi-factor authentication perspective, what happens is one of the biggest attacks out with Microsoft recently released a statistic that 99% of the incidents that they responded to could have been prevented by multi-factor authentication. 99% of the incidents that they responded to, just by that one specific thing right there. And so multi-factor authentication, why it's important to understand is that a lot of these COVID-19 campaigns are all about trying to steal your username and password. And so if they steal your username and password, and a lot of times your passwords are weak, there's summer 2019 or summer 2020, Cavs 2020, whatever it ends up being. I know there's no Cavs going on right now, but a lot of these things kind of happening. And so, attackers can guess your passwords. And what also happens is that there's a lot of sites that get breached. And so what'll happen is, let's just say your Google Gmail gets compromised and they have all of those passwords. What they'll do is they have these automation tools that will take all of the associated email addresses and the passwords, and they'll try that password across all of your different, type of, Facebook, social media, Microsoft, Microsoft Online or Office 365, and they'll get those passwords and they'll try authenticating to all of those, and they can guess those. So what happens is, once they guess your password, If you don't have multi-factor authentication in place, they have direct access to your computer, or not your computer, but your your emails, your online resources, things like that, and sometimes directly to your computer. There are attacks that you can do through Office 365 that allow hackers to create essentially what are called rules to get code to run in your computer, and then from there fully compromise your entire computer directly through your inbox online. And so with multi-factor authentication, what happens is that if they do get your password, if it's the first time that they've logged into that machine from that system, it's going to require you to enter in your second PIN on your phone. And if they don't have access to your phone, which they definitely shouldn't, then they no longer have access to that account. So it protects that account from being compromised. So multi-factor authentication is very important. Our recommendation is to use what we call authenticator apps and not the text message methods. Text messages are okay, but they're not great. There are ways of getting around that. There's SIM cloning, where you can clone somebody's SIM and then from there get the text messages associated to them. So our best recommendation there is to download an authenticator app. My personal favorite is Microsoft Authenticator, and what it is it's an app that lives on your phone. And when you go to use it for the first time, it'll have a QR code that's on your screen, and you scan the QR code from the app itself, and it then pairs your phone with that specific authenticating service, like Office 365. And then it incrementally changes the PIN over time. I don't know if anybody remembers the old RSA tokens that used to have that would rotate on there. It's basically the same exact thing, but it's on your phone. It's more of what we call a soft token on there. That's the more desirable method, is using Microsoft Authenticator. And Microsoft Authenticator works for every other app out there, and it's not just for Office 365. It can work for Google, it can work for Facebook, it can work for Twitter, it can work for pretty much every aspect of what you have for multi-factor authentication. And we recommend putting that across, all of your personal devices, as well as what you're doing from a company perspective. The number two piece is endpoint detection and visibility. Having a good understanding around what's happening in your infrastructure, so that when a machine becomes compromised, that you can isolate that machine and stop the exposure itself to your corporate infrastructure is very, very important. If you look at that statistic I gave before, just a couple slides ago, you look over here, within 4 hours, hackers had already moved to 30 systems on the network. 4 hours. So you have a 4-hour window to respond to a specific attack to reduce the amount of impact you have to an organization. And so when you look at that, you don't have a lot of time to respond to these specific attacks. And so you have to have visibility on who the initial patient zero is, the first person that gets compromised, move that machine off of the network so it can no longer communicate with the rest, stop that damage from actually happening to your organization. So really having visibility into your endpoints is very critical. That's your highest risk factor right now. Network architecture and segmentation is a big one as well. Can you isolate and keep machines in their own networks so they're not talking to the rest of the entire company itself? A Citrix environment is a great example. If you have a Citrix environment, is that Citrix environment on the internal network that has access to everything, or is it contained in its own little island that allows it not to communicate to certain things? So network architecture and segmentation becomes really important, because if you think about it, let's just say you're on a flat network and Bob and Mary machines can talk to one another. Once I compromise Bob's machine, I can now move to Mary's machine. I can move from Mary's machine to this machine, to this machine, to that machine, until I get access to the servers, and now I have access to the entire organization. Whereas if Bob and Mary can't communicate with one another, and they can't talk to one another, can't see one another, I can't spread and move to a different machine and move laterally across the environment. I have to go to the servers now. That's a little bit harder. Hopefully I increase my visibility. So there's a lot of things that happen around network architecture and segmentation that become really important. In addition, talking about cloud services as being number 4, a lot of companies are really trying to overhaul and move to the cloud. And out of the last 10 assessments we've done against a organization that has moved to a cloud infrastructure, we've hacked into 9 of them. And it's usually due to misconfiguration, not setting it up appropriately, and not having a good architecture in place designed to handle security threats towards those cloud environments. That's a great statistic. 90% success rate of going against a cloud service environment, is pretty scary. But when you look at from a cloud perspective, companies have a unique opportunity in the cloud to design and architect things in a way that allows them to be much more secure. A lot of people, you might have heard of the term zero trust models. You have the ability to essentially become a service provider versus an entire, open up, shop to everybody and minimize the attack surfaces that people have. So cloud security is extremely important in these times, especially as people move to it. There's a lot of concern right now around Zoom. Zoom is getting destroyed right now from a privacy perspective. If you look at their privacy metrics or their privacy policies, it basically says that we can record and use any of the information that you use on our Zoom conference calls for any marketing purposes or anything that we want to use it for in the first place from a Zoom perspective. So your internal corporate, company calls, things like that are all in scope of that specific pieces there. So again, cloud services becomes an important piece to look at when you're going through all of this. And then most importantly, I think this is probably one of the most important, maybe second or third. It's hard to say which one's the most important because multi-factor authentication is really important, and endpoint detection and visibility is. But educating your users around what's happening right now is so monumentally important. Knowing that there's phishing campaigns coming out around COVID-19, understanding the risks around remote workforces, all of those things become really, really important for users to understand. Making sure that they have a good understanding around, here's the things that are possible, here's the things that attackers are doing, and here's how being in your own home network, things that could be challenging for you and from a home security perspective. All of those things become really important to educate our workforce, especially as they're remote, to help them understand these threats that they're facing in their individual organizations. So right now, those are the top 5 things that we recommend for our customers, for our companies, especially as they're going from a remote work from home strategy, and that really makes a big difference. There's no question that the threat's real. We're seeing targeted campaigns out there around organizations around the world. Our incident response team is busier than they've ever been before, since the conceivement of our companies. And that's an interesting piece there, is that we're seeing just such a high level of breaches occur during these pieces of time, which is such an unfortunate event. Last thing I'll cover as you're talking to your customers, one thing that we can do, especially in a remote workforce strategy, is that we have software that deploys literally in minutes that gives companies full visibility into what's actually happening out there. So if you look at the top 5 things, we very much focus on that number 2 aspect out there, where we can get visibility to your to customers very fast to determine whether or not they've been compromised, help them stop the breaches, prevent them in the first place. All of those things can literally be operational from a remote workforce strategy. We work both on-prem, off-prem, in the cloud, everywhere else, where their entire fleet now has the ability to identify threats immediately by people that are monitoring 24/7, 365. And if a machine actually gets compromised, we can move it off of the network and prevent a company from actually becoming breached large scale. So again, that's really how we help in these specific times, is really trying to identify the hackers, what they're doing, their patterns, make sure that we stay ahead of the curve for the types of techniques they're using, the methods that they're using to compromise, and make sure that we can respond in a few minutes versus 4 hours after they've already had access to an entire organization. So that's really what I had here. I like to relying extremely heavily off of technology. Technology is essentially what's keeping us operational today. I mean, if we didn't have the current capabilities of today, we would not be being operational as companies themselves. And with that, you have an increased risk because your entire workforce is completely built upon foundationally on technology. You have to protect that. If you don't, what ends up happening is you run into a situation where you have a very high probability or risk that your entire company is shut down. And that is even more detrimental than anything else. And it's if you look at it in the grand scheme of things, investing in security is a small percentage of your overall cost of what you're dealing with from a technology perspective. Usually we see, security as being around 5 to 6% of the overall IT budget. So it's a small investment, overall. I mean, that's doing security the right way, right? There are things that you can do quickly to speed up and to increase your ability to respond to those threats, to make sure that your company stays operational during these times. And that is very much cost effective towards the amount of spend that you're going to have to deal with if everything shuts down. So it's more so, looking at it from a risk perspective, and that's all companies are doing right now. They're saying, listen, we have risks all over the place. All of our we're seeing a substantial decrease in our revenues and our money, everything that's happening there. Where do I spend to reduce as much risk as possible so I can stay operational as a company? Security is definitely one of those top pieces right there, because all the companies are running from a technology perspective.